Okay, so now we're going to be looking at how to use routers and filters in your scenarios. Now, here's an example from our previous lesson, and you can see we're using quite a lot of routers here as well as a lot of filters. So we've got our routers up the top, and then we've got our filters, which are shown with these little filter icons, and quite often you'll be using these two elements together. So let's have a look at how to add them to our scenario and when we might use them. So we want to add a router. So we click on Flow Control, and then we can click on Router. And then we can just drag that in to our scenario. Now you'll notice that when I drag a module in, it automatically creates a router for me. But I can also just put it at the end of the scenario if you prefer to build, by dragging and dropping a router onto the page. What I normally do though is I don't usually ever drag and drop the routers on. I normally just get my module and I want to put another route here, and so I'll just drag this in. And you want to drag it to that first bubble between the small three bubbles that you see on the left. If you drag it to the right, so that right bubble, you'll pop the router on the wrong side. So depending on what side you want to go onto, you can drag it in. Then you just let go of that and you'll have your new router added. Now, when you add that router to the page, what you'll find is it will mess up the look of things. I like everything to be clean. So if we add that here as a router, now here it might be a little bit tricky to add that router with this method because the router is basically trying to capture this module rather than creating the new router. So in that instance, I could right-click on the route and then add a router here and then add that as well. So there's three ways to add routers to your scenarios. But I distracted myself there. So what I wanted to show you was that when you add a new router, it often messes up the layout of things. So if we drag this in here, you can see, well, now this thing's kind of sitting in the middle of nowhere, and these are all out of place, and things start to look messy. Well, normally you'd want to auto-align it just so it makes it all look nice, spaces everything nicely again. And more importantly, or most importantly, is that as soon as you start using routers, you really have to use that auto-align function. I see a lot of people building scenarios, and their scenarios look like this. They're all pretty, and they've put all the purple things together, and all the blue things sit over here, and all the green things sit over here, and I've literally seen scenarios that look like this, right? And I look at it, and the client says, I don't understand. I don't know why it's not working. And I look at it and I go, okay, well, the first problem is it looks like a pile of spaghetti here. You have no idea what's going on, what's happening, in what order. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't visually see what's happening, right? And as soon as you're using routers, you absolutely have to use this auto-align feature. You have to have it laid out like this. Try and get away from that whole pretty blue things together and however else people do them. I see them doing like making their name on the thing, putting their letters on and all this sort of rubbish. It doesn't make any sense. Keep it simple, nice and auto-align. But the main thing is that when you're using routers, the order of the routes matters. And the order is determined by when those modules were connected to the router. So here, and it's not determined by how those modules visually appear to be connected to the router, right? So here, visually, you might think that this router has route number 1, and that when data comes down, it's going to go up this route first, and it's going to do the first route here, and then it's going to go to this module here. And you might think that when it comes here, it's going to go to this module here. Nope, 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 nope. That's not how it works. And this is why it's so important to use the auto-align, because it works based on when you last connected those modules. Those modules maintain their position of when they were connected in relation to the other modules that are connected to that router. So if we click auto align, we'll see the actual true order of those routes for when a data comes to it. So now we know that we've clicked the auto align. We know that this route on top is the first thing to be processed, right? The data is going to hit this router. It's going to go, okay, I need to take route 1 first. It's going to go, right, I'm going to complete the route 1. I'm going to go to this module, do that thing, this, comes to the second router, and it goes, okay, same thing. I take route number 1, and I need to finish my entire journey of all the first routes. Gets to the end of route number 1. It goes, okay, great. I'm going to go back to where I last made a decision for which route to take. And then I'm going to take the next route in the order that it's supposed to be taken. So now I'm going to go to route number 2. I'm going to do this thing. Okay, now I've finished all the legs on this route. There's nothing more for me to do at this point. So I'm going to go all the way back, and I'm going to then go to route number 2. Now, what actually happens is the data thing doesn't go all the way back. It actually splits it at these routers. So if you had 20 connections at a router, what happens is it gets that data and it goes, right, I've got 3 possible routes, split it into 3, like duplicate it 3 times. First thing's going to do that one. Then once that's finished processing, I'm going to process the second thing for this route. It's going to do that. And then I'm going to process the third duplication, which is going to do this, right? So let's have a look at if you wanted to add this thing as route number 2. Well, we've already covered that you can't just drag it in there as route number 2. That's not going to work. If we click the auto align, you can see it's not holding the position in the order, right? So to move this to route number 2, we have to disconnect and to right click and unlink the other routes in front of this route here. Then we reconnect them in the order that we want them to process in. And I'm really driving home this point because it's really, really important when you're working with routers. This is the number one thing that people get wrong with routers and why they don't work how they think they should work in this scenario. So now we've put that in place number 2. We can put it in place number 1 up the top here if we wanted. We would unlink this, relink that here, and let's say we want to maintain that as place number 2. Well, now currently this is place number 3. If I hit that, right, it's place number 3. I would unlink this to put that last, and now that's in place number 3. Okay, so that's how you change the order of the routes. Now you might be thinking, well, why is he stressing so much about this? You know, it doesn't seem that big of a deal if this happens before this. Let's have a look at an example. Here we've got a scenario. We've got data coming in from Bubble. And in this scenario, the first thing that we want to happen is we want to find the customer in QuickBooks. We want to search them in QuickBooks, create them or update them in QuickBooks. And we have to do that first because the next thing that happens for QuickBooks is we're getting that customer and we're adding an invoice or updating an invoice for that customer. We have to know the customer before we create or update the invoice. We can't create or update the invoice for nobody and then link the customer to it afterwards. It's not possible with QuickBooks. So the order of how things happen in the scenario is really, really important. And if things aren't working how you think or you're getting a whole bunch of errors, a lot of the time it's the order of how things are being processed. And it's always comes back to the routers, and most of the time it's because you haven't auto-aligned the routes. You don't know, what the true order is. So now we've covered that, let's have a look at filters. And there's no limit to how many routes you can have on a router. I've seen them with like 50 on there. I don't think there's any limit, haven't hit it. Normally you'd only have like 10, maybe 20, but I'll actually show you one that's got a lot of routes on it. Okay, so this is an absolute monster of a router scenario, but it really drives home and shows the purpose of these routers. Now, the actual scenario builder itself, it does have a limit to the number of modules that you can add to the scenario. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many that is. I think it's either 50 or 100. This particular scenario, I know, hit that limit, and we had to split it out into 2 scenarios. Essentially, this thing is creating say 20 different Google Drive folders, and a lot of these are like folders within folders. And so let's have a look at this being created. We're creating the parent photo shoot folder. Then we've got a router, and we're adding that folder ID to our database. And then here's where we're actually triggering part 2 of this scenario, which is a whole separate scenario that runs from that point. And then we create a subfolder within our photo shoot folder. And then within that subfolder, we then create these subfolders, and then we store some of those in our database for later reference. And then in this particular subfolder for pics, which I think is photos that we're picking, then we create another 7 subfolders, and then this one here has another subfolder there. So you can sort of see the structure of these Google Drive folders, and these get created when a project is approved for this particular client. The folder structure just gets built out automatically, and it's all named, and it has the client name, etc. in there. So that's an example of routers, but in here we also have filters. So let's have a look at filters over here. So on the route, you can click on the route, the dots between the router and the next module, these little dots here, and that will allow you to add a filter. Now you can name this filter, and you can put in, say, test filter, whatever you want to put in there. And then you've got the option of adding a condition with an and, or, an or rule. Now an and rule means that condition number 1 and condition number 2 must be met. An or rule means that the first condition, and you'll notice that the or has a line across here, and you've also got a blue line here. Now what this or does is it breaks apart the ands into multiple groups, right? So if we had, I'll make it simple, we'll just have 3 or conditions. If we do it this way, well, this condition has to be met, or this condition has to be met, or this condition has to be met. If we add an and rule, it would be this condition has to be met, separated by the blue or this condition, which is this condition and this condition, has to be met, or this condition here has to be met. Right? So you can see the ands stack on each other, but they only stack until they hit an or. Now, this is not the best way to build this, but it's how Make has built it, and they haven't changed it. So it is what it is. But it would mean that if, for instance, you wanted to filter for companies where the name contains case-insensitive M, letter M, or you wanted to filter for companies where the name does not contain, or maybe it says contains the letter A, right? If you did that, well, now you've just created your conditions here, right? So you've got this condition or this condition, and I think if we run that now, we should still meet our target. If I take out the A, Apple doesn't have an M in it, so it will only process Microsoft through this route here. Let's get rid of that. So let's run this now. These set variables won't do anything. So remember, we've got our 2 companies returned here, Microsoft and Apple. And we've got our filter here, and we're filtering for the name of the company must contain anywhere in its name the letter M. And we've also set this to be case insensitive, which means that it will match either capital letter or lowercase letter m. Then if we run the scenario and we click on our filter, we can actually see what bundles were tested against that condition. So this first condition, the bundle was Microsoft for the name of the company. That contained an M. The second one was Apple Inc. That did not contain an M, and it did not pass the condition. Now, if we have multiple conditions here, we'll do an OR rule, and we'll put name, and we'll put contains A. Right? Microsoft doesn't contain A, so that's good. So we'll run this here. Now, we'll see that Microsoft went through the condition of the first condition, which was name contains M. It met that condition. It did not have to test the second condition. That's why this is blank here. because it met the first condition, and we're using an OR statement. Match first condition or match second condition. Apple tried to match the first condition and it failed. Got a failure error here. So then it tried to match the second condition and it succeeded. So then we've got a green check mark here. So here you can see that now you've got your filters working here. We can stack the filters on and we can do things like if the name or maybe the number is greater than, let's say down to numeric operators, we'll say greater than 30. So if a number is greater than 30, then we want to get the records, right? So we'll just run that here. And I'm purposely trying to keep it fairly simple with the examples so that I don't overwhelm you with too much complexity in here. I'm trying to break these down to the simple nuts and bolts. So we can see here that the number was 12, which is less than 30, 12, which is less than 30, 12, less than 30, 12, less than 30. Then we've got 42, greater than 30, 35, greater than 30, and then 16, which is less than 30. So there was only 2 that passed our filter here, which means that even though we had 7 things at this point, only 2 things continued on to the next part in our process here. So you can see how filters can be combined with routers to ensure that your data is going down the correct routes. And a real life example of this would be on this page here. We're using routers for if this photo shoot is paused, well then we want to add a special tag, or we want to remove a tag in ActiveCampaign for that contact. If this photo shoot has a call date, then we want to update a custom field and update 2 custom fields, right? So we're only updating fields or only adding tags or removing tags because it passes a filter, because that data passes a filter. Here we're adding a folder if the folder doesn't exist after we search for it here, and then we're setting that in variables. We're probably referencing those later. Down here we can see that we're only doing this whole leg, and remember this router, this filter is filtering all of this here on the right, that little filter here is controlling it. There's only one way to get to the rest of this logic over here, and it's to pass through this filter. So when you're debugging and looking at scenarios, it's often the filters that are the things that either need to be added or adjusted or that are incorrect, because they're what stop. They're the doors into the next processes in your workflows, right? And if the data doesn't have the key to get through the door, it's not going to run that part of the workflow. It's going to completely skip it, and you're not going to get an error for it. It's just not going to pass the filter, okay? So that controls the whole of this right side. And if we look down here, we've got another little filter here for if the DAD contact exists, well then we want to go ahead and add the DAD to ActiveCampaign and map a whole bunch of fields for the DAD. And it looks like we're, I don't know, adding some links and scheduling a call or something for DAD here, right? So all this only happens if there is a DAD for the photo shoot in this example. If there's no DAD, well, all of these steps, they don't happen at all, right? They're just, nope, no DAD, don't need to do any of that, skip it, right? So not only will it help you build very complex logic into your scenarios, it will also help you reduce the number of operations and reduce the number of errors that you're getting if you're using the right filters. So if we didn't have a filter here, what would happen is we would try to get DAD in our database, and that would error because we didn't have the ID for DAD because he doesn't exist, right? So we'd get an error here, and we might have to put an error handler in at this point here to handle that. But if we use a filter, we're not going to get an error at this module, which means that our scenario is not going to stop because it's not going to error. And we're sort of preempting that error using a filter here instead. Quite often when I get those error messages in the email, I'll look at them and I really need to decide, and I cover this in the error handling lesson, but I decide, does this require an error handler or would it be better served with a filter? And answering that question, most of the time, it's better served with a filter than it is adding an error handler. That's because error handlers are catch-alls unless you use filters on the error handlers, right, which we cover in the error handling module. So hopefully that's explained our routers and filters to you. A quick recap, the routers, very important to get the right order of the routes there, particularly if you're looking at something like this. You've got a huge amount of logic in here. It has to be in the right order for it to work correctly. And then filters, they act as doors for each of those routes. And your data has to have the right key to open that door to continue on its path down that route.